Have you ever noticed that the loudest conversation you'll carry all day is the one happening in your own head? What if the words you whisper there could ripple all the way to the streets of Gaza and the halls of power in Beijing? Let's lean in together, because the story we tell ourselves next might just rewrite the story we share with the world. When I walk onto any stage, I can feel, not just hear, the hush that falls across an audience hungry for truth. Yet the very first voice that greets me is always my own. It is the single, unrelenting narrator that has followed me from my grandmother's porch in Mississippi all the way to studio lights in Chicago. For years I believed the loudest conversations were the ones broadcast through microphones or printed in bold headlines. But time and countless interviews where eyes glistened as secrets cracked open taught me that the most transformative dialogue any human being will ever host is the one that echoes inside the chambers of their own heart. Self-talk is not a soft whisper lost in the shuffle of daily errands. It is the architect of our internal infrastructure. When we rise each morning, the first story we tell ourselves becomes the scaffolding upon which every other story of the day is built. Picture the mind as a vast production studio, complete with directors, set designers, lighting engineers. The script they follow, it's drafted line by the thoughts we choose to entertain. A single sentence, "I am worthy of love," or conversely, "I don't deserve to be heard," can cue an entire chorus of beliefs ready to reinforce that line, turning perception into lived reality. I have sat across from billionaires and from women who have scraped together bus fare to reach our conversation, and here is the revelation: both groups are equally governed by the tenor of their self-dialogue. Consider the days we rehearse failure before we even attempt success. We stand in the shower, and our thoughts dial up every possible stumble, the presentation that might falter, the friendship that could fracture, the future that feels too fragile. Neurologists tell us that the brain fires almost the same patterns whether we imagine an act or physically perform it. That means every imagined defeat stains the neural pathways as though it had already unfolded. We become, quite literally, the prophets of our own downfall, unless we choose different words. Now imagine that same shower scene, but this time the internal monologue rehearses resilience. "I have weathered storms before. I know the taste of perseverance. I carry within me the quiet data of past triumphs." Those words are not wishful thinking. They are neural conditioning. They train the brain to scout for possibility, to recognize opportunity, to metabolize fear into courage. Self-talk also determines how we metabolize the pain of others. When we feed ourselves narratives of scarcity, there isn't enough compassion to go around. We guard our empathy like rations in wartime. Yet when the inner voice sings abundance, love multiplies when shared, we pour that empathy freely, crossing boundaries of creed, color, and continent. This truth becomes urgent when global crises flicker across our screens. If my private voice tells me, "Your comfort matters most," I will scroll by images of suffering with clinical detachment. But if my inner narrator affirms, "Your humanity is tethered to theirs," my heart begins a pilgrimage toward action. The ripple effect is seismic. What started as an individual affirmation grows into collective momentum, shifting policies, reallocating resources, redrawing moral maps. I remember coaching a young teacher who doubted her capacity to inspire. She would stand at the doorway of her classroom feeling smaller than the rows of restless teenagers. Together we practiced a simple ritual. Before turning the knob each morning, she whispered, "I am a carrier of light, and these students will feel its warmth." 6 months later, her classroom buzzed with curiosity, attendance rose, disciplinary notes plummeted. The change began not with new textbooks or smarter technology, but with a recalibrated inner dialogue. That is the clandestine might of self-talk. It converts private conviction into public consequence, ensuring that the universe outside us begins to mirror the universe we cultivate within. Self-talk is also the first responder to trauma. Long before a therapist's office or a friend's embrace can intervene, our thoughts sprint toward the hemorrhaging wound. Will they apply a tourniquet of compassion, or will they pour salt into the hurt, echoing the judgment of those who harmed us? Survivors who learn to speak gently to themselves, to say what happened to me was not my fault, and my future is still mine to sculpt, activate neural pathways that trigger resilience, lower cortisol, steady the heart. This is not self-help jargon, it is biology meeting spirituality at the crossroads of possibility. Thus, in a moment when the world stage feels choked with loud, divisive rhetoric, our first act of quiet rebellion is to curate the tone within. Before hashtags, before speeches, before votes cast or protests marched, there is the intimate ceremony of spoken thought shaping unseen futures. Honor that ceremony, tend to it daily, knowing it handles the clay from which courage, compassion, and history itself are molded. Courage beyond borders, China and Palestine, a mirror for us all, choosing voice over echo, from inner dialogue to global dialogue. Courage beyond borders. Courage is often framed as a singular spotlighted act, a firefighter bursting through smoke, a whistleblower releasing files, a lone protester standing before a tank. But there is another kind of courage, subtler yet no less potent, the courage that crosses invisible lines drawn by history, religion, and geopolitical interest. I call it borderless courage, and it asks us to extend our moral imagination the neighborhood of our own experience, to feel responsible for lives whose languages we may not speak, whose customs we may never practice, yet whose humanity mirrors our own. Think about the maps we studied in grade school, brightly colored patches separated by bold black lines. Those lines taught us where one country ends and another begins, but they did not teach us where empathy should stop. In fact, every political border was once imagined before it was enforced. It exists because someone decided to draw it. The human heart, however, is born without cartographical training. A newborn has no concept of us and them, only the instinct to reach and be held. Borderless courage is a return to that primal clarity, but guided now by wisdom and choice. It becomes especially profound when a nation steps forward for a cause seemingly outside its cultural or religious orbit. Picture the diplomatic halls where interests are bartered like commodities, oil for weapons, trade concessions for silence. In that setting, to champion the rights of a distant people, with no obvious profit to gain, is to disturb the choreography of self-interest that usually dominates global affairs. It is a decision that says, our integrity is not for sale, our compassion is not transactional. Such moves ripple outward, unsettling cynicism, and reminding weary onlookers that principles can still outrank profits. I have witnessed individuals embody this courage in daily life. A Christian pastor in Atlanta raising funds to rebuild a mosque vandalized by hate. A Jewish mother in New Jersey teaching her children Arabic phrases so they can greet their Muslim classmates during Ramadan. These gestures may seem small beside the machinery of statecraft, but they are the micro-revolutions that accumulate into macro change. Because courage is contagious, it leaps from one beating heart to the next like a spark seeking kindling. When a non-Muslim nation publicly aligns itself with Palestine, it offers the world a parable in real time. It declares that oppression, no matter where it festers, diminishes us all. That declaration disrupts convenient narratives suggesting we only defend those who look, worship, or vote like us. Suddenly, citizens elsewhere must confront their own moral calculations. If they with no shared scripture or shared soil can speak out, what is stopping me? Silence loses its camouflage. Neutrality is unmasked as a choice rather than an inevitability. There is also a practical genius to borderless courage. Coalitions built on shared empathy rather than shared enemies tend to be more resilient. Fear-based alliances crumble when the immediate threat fades, but compassion-based alliances deepen with time because they are rooted in recognition of shared dignity. History's most luminous movements, from the abolition of slavery to the dismantling of apartheid, were powered by people who felt called to act beyond their demographic lanes. They did not wait for perfect affiliation, they responded to perfect conviction. Borderless courage, however, exacts a price. It may invite economic retaliation, diplomatic isolation, or scathing headlines branding one a traitor to national interest. Yet every era offers evidence that moral imagination eventually rewrites public opinion. Remember how early opponents of child labor were mocked as idealists jeopardizing industrial growth. Today their stance is codified in law and celebrated in textbooks. The arc of justice, as Dr. King reminded us, bends toward those willing to be bent out of shape by conscience. For the ordinary citizen watching these grand gestures on the news ticker, the question becomes, what is my version of crossing a border? Perhaps it is crossing the street to comfort a neighbor targeted by slurs. Perhaps it is crossing the aisle at work to advocate for policies benefiting colleagues who do not share your faith. The geography of courage begins at the edge of our comfort zone and expands outward in concentric rings: home, workplace, community, nation, world. Each step redraws the map of belonging. We must also recognize the interior borders we keep, fortified stories about who is worthy of our empathy. Some of those walls were inherited from family lore, others erected by fear-fueled media loops. Borderless courage asks us to audit those inner frontiers. Which prejudices have I mistaken for preferences? Which stereotypes have I allowed to ossify into facts? Tear down one psychic checkpoint, and you shift the architecture of your perception. In a digital age where algorithms curate echo chambers, intentional border crossing is spiritual exercise. It means clicking on articles from outlets outside our ideological diet, listening to music in languages we do not understand, following activists whose struggles do not mirror our own. This practice enlarges our emotional vocabulary, equipping us to greet distant suffering, not with pity but with kinship. And kinship, once tasted, becomes a craving. It is the sweetest defiance against forces that thrive on division. China and Palestine, a mirror for us all, choosing voice over echo. From inner dialogue to global dialogue, China and Palestine, a mirror for us all. The news cycle tends to cast nations as monolithic actors, great stone statues that move only when history's winds blow hard enough. Yet beneath each headline you will find people with pulse and complexity, contending with fear, pride, memory, and aspiration, just like the rest of us. When China, a country whose political calculus is often read through the lens of trade balances and territorial disputes, steps onto the moral stage to voice solidarity with Palestine, something intimate and human breaks through the granite stereotype. The act becomes more than a diplomatic maneuver. It transforms into a mirror, one large enough to catch the reflections of every nation and every individual watching. First, it reveals how power can be reframed. We often equate power with dominance, with the ability to impose will or secure advantage, but here we see a different facet: the capacity to lend weight to the voiceless. China's statement did not change facts on the ground overnight, did not roll back blockades or soften checkpoints in a single stroke, yet its resonance traveled further than missiles and farther than embargoes. Why? Because moral alignment from a heavyweight amplifies the pleas of those long forced into a whisper. Power, then, is not solely about leverage. It is about megaphoning justice in rooms where silence has grown habitual. Second, the mirror invites us to examine our own patterns of selective empathy. The global north in particular has mastered the rhetoric of human rights, but its empathy can arrive on a delay, triggered only when the victims align with familiar cultural scripts. When an Eastern giant, often critiqued for its own rights record, chooses to speak out ahead of Western democracies, the cognitive dissonance unsettles comfy moral hierarchies. The mirror asks, do we champion freedom only when it flatters our geopolitical narratives? Do our tears flow faster for those whose passports resemble our own? In this this reflection we discover the contours of our compassion and the blind spots we would rather ignore. Third, the episode underscores the complexity of global solidarity in a world of competing narratives. There are skeptics who will say, China is calculating, this is mere posturing, and perhaps strategists in Beijing did weigh the benefits of courting influence among Muslim-majority countries, but the presence of strategic interest does not automatically negate moral content. Human actions are rarely born of a single motive. They are braids of principle and pragmatism, of heart and mind. The lesson for us is not to demand pure altruism before we applaud solidarity. Such purity is a mirage, but to recognize that even tangled motives can yield honest advancements in justice. Our task is to hold all actors, including ourselves, accountable for the outcomes we create, not just the motives we claim. Fourth, the event illuminates the ripple physics of moral courage. Within hours of China's stance, social media platforms lit up across continents, some condemned, some celebrated, but almost everyone engaged. That surge of dialogue matters, because conversation is the seedbed of policy. When a superpower changes its tone, it licenses smaller states, NGOs, and citizens to reassess their own. Courage begets courage, dissent begets dissent, and suddenly the margins of what is acceptable discourse expand. Silence, once the safest policy for bystanders, begins to feel like complicity. In that shifting atmosphere, even gestures that seem symbolic can accumulate density, tipping the balance from resignation toward possibility. Finally, the mirror turns inward to the micro level, zooming from statecraft to soulcraft. Each of us operates a tiny foreign policy within our daily lives, deciding who merits our attention, where we invest our time, which injustices we deem worthy of public lament. China's choice reminds us that alignment across difference is both an opportunity and a responsibility. You do not need embassies or ministries to practice diplomacy of the heart. You only need the willingness to let someone else's pain complicate your comfort. When we allow distant tragedies to interrupt our routines, we practice a form of citizenship that transcends passports, drafting treaties of empathy across the borders of habit, choosing voice over echo, from inner dialogue to global dialogue, choosing voice over echo. Scroll through any feed and you will witness a dazzling hall of mirrors, opinions reflecting opinions, outrage, mirroring outrage, the same phrases ricocheting from account to account until they lose the resonance of real conviction. It is so easy, seductively easy, to slip into the comfort of echo, to retweet a slogan, to copy-paste a caption, and to mistake the flash of digital noise for the substance of moral presence. Yet history's hinge moments were never swung open by echoes. They were pried loose by singular, trembling, stubborn voices willing to risk discord for the sake of truth. Choosing voice over echo begins with discernment. Before we press share, we must pause and ask, is this my understanding or merely my appetite for belonging? Speaking. Belonging is a powerful drug. It floods the brain with oxytocin, soothing the ancient fear of exile. But movements that rely solely on borrowed words develop a brittle shell. The first gust of opposition cracks them. True voice, by contrast, is tempered like steel in the forge of reflection. It requires reading beyond headlines, sitting with discomfort, interrogating sources, translating statistics into human stakes. Only then does a statement emerge that can withstand scrutiny, because it has been vetted by conscience rather than crowds. Voice also carries accountability. When I sign my name to a stance, I tether my future actions to that declaration. If I claim solidarity with Palestinians, my calendar and checkbook must eventually bear witness. Donations made, petitions signed, conversations hosted, politicians pressed. Echo lets me outsource responsibility. I can forward a meme and move on, congratulating myself for being aware. Voice refuses that escape hatch. It insists that awareness evolve into agency, that sympathy mature into sustained engagement. There is a physiological component as well. Neuroscientists note that speaking aloud engages different neural circuits than silent reading. The vibrations of our own vocal cords feed sensory feedback loops, embedding memories more deeply. When I articulate a conviction in my own words, whether on a microphone or across a dinner table, I am literally imprinting that belief into my neural architecture. Echo, performed with a click, rarely penetrates that deeply. This is why public commitments, from marriage vows to courtroom oaths, rely on spoken declarations. Sound carries binding power. Choosing voice over echo also reshapes the digital commons. Algorithms privilege engagement, and engagement often springs from novelty. When thousands of users parrot identical phrasing, the signal-to-noise ratio plummets. Original analysis, nuanced critique, and first-hand testimony slice through that fog like lighthouse beams, guiding others toward more textured understanding. In this way, each authentic voice becomes both participant and curator, elevating discourse by modeling depth over volume. Yet the path to voice is strewn with obstacles: fear of backlash, fear of missteps, fear of isolation. We watch public figures dragged for errors, and we conclude that silence is safer, but silence breeds hollowness. It leaves the narrative terrain to be colonized by the loudest, not the wisest. Courage, therefore, is not the absence of fear but the resolve to prioritize integrity over approval. I often tell young activists, perfection is not the prerequisite for participation. You will make mistakes. Correct them. You will learn new facts. Update your stance. Voice is a living organism, evolving with evidence and empathy. Echo is taxidermy, static, unchanging, eventually dusty. To cultivate voice, practice deliberate speaking rituals. Keep a journal where you draft your thoughts before publishing them. Engage in slow dialogue. Phone calls instead of comments. Letters instead of likes. Seek out interlocutors who challenge rather than flatter you. Read primary sources. Follow accounts outside your ideological comfort. These habits fertilize original insight. They also inoculate against the adrenaline-spiked outrage that social media merchants sell for profit. There is a sacred dimension too. Many traditions teach that words possess creative force, that the universe itself unfolded from a divine utterance. When we squander our linguistic power on hollow repetition, we diminish that sacred inheritance. But when we craft speech that springs from empathy and evidence, we participate in the ongoing act of creation, building worlds more truthful than the ones we inherited. From inner dialogue to global dialogue. From inner dialogue to global dialogue. Every sweeping movement that rewrites the pages of history starts as a murmur in someone's mind. A quiet, almost fragile question: what if the world could be kinder? That question, repeated and refined in the secrecy of self-talk, gradually stiffens into conviction, and conviction seeks company. Thus the intimate monologue becomes a public dialogue, rippling outward from a single beating heart to communities, to cities, to entire continents, until the very architecture of society feels the tremor. We often imagine change descending from podiums and parliaments, yet the genesis of collective transformation is far more personal, anchored in the conversations we host with ourselves when no audience is present. Consider how the cadence of our private thoughts sets the tempo of our public actions. A mind rehearsing narratives of cynicism. Nothing will ever change. People are inherently selfish. Will approach civic life with a guarded stance, investing minimal energy in petitions or protests, because futility is the default forecast. Conversely, an inner dialogue trained on possibility, systems are designed by humans and therefore can be redesigned, primes its host to detect and seize openings for reform. Neuroscience validates this linkage. When we adopt empowering internal scripts, the brain's reward circuitry lights up at the prospect of altruistic action, making engagement feel less like sacrifice and more like self-expression. In other words, hope is not mere sentiment. It is neurochemical fuel for sustained activism. The journey from inner to global dialogue passes through relational portals, family dinners, office break rooms, faith gatherings, book clubs. These are the laboratories where fledgling ideas are stress tested. If the concept survives ridicule at the cousin's barbecue, if it can withstand the skeptic coworker's cross-examination, it grows resilient enough for the harsher winds of the public square. Each interpersonal exchange serves as a tuning fork, helping us refine tone, deepen nuance and fortify evidence. In this way, private conviction metabolizes into collective vocabulary, catchphrases, chance policy proposals, until a once solitary sentiment becomes recognizable currency in the marketplace of ideas. Digital platforms accelerate this amplification, but they also expose the fragility of under-seasoned thought. A slogan tweeted before it has cooled in reflection can implode under the weight of global scrutiny. Therefore, the bridge from inner to global dialogue must be built with the steel of self-interrogation. Have I accounted for complexity? Am I willing to update my stance in light of new data? Do I understand the lived experience of those directly affected? Such questions cultivate intellectual humility, which is oxygen for any dialogue that aims to be both expansive and enduring. Empathy functions as the passport enabling these conversations to cross borders without losing authenticity. When our self-talk rehearses empathy, their grief is as real as mine. We develop an instinct to listen before we lecture, to translate statistics into stories, to foreground the voices of those at the epicenter of harm. This reflex inoculates global dialogue against the colonial impulse to speak for rather than with. It ensures that solidarity does not become a performance of saviorhood, but a choreography of shared agency, in which each participant contributes expertise born of proximity or privilege. Language itself evolves in this exchange. Terminology once confined to academic journals, intersectionality, settler colonialism, carceral logic seeps into mainstream discourse, equipping more people to diagnose and articulate injustice. The lexicon of resistance, once niche, scales up, enabling cross-movement synergy, climate activists learning from Black liberation frameworks, disability advocates partnering with migrant rights coalitions. Such intersections are possible because individuals first allowed their inner dialogues to be fertilized by perspectives beyond their default horizons, thereby widening the semantic palette with which they paint the future. Spiritual traditions offer rituals that echo this trajectory. In many faiths, prayer or meditation precedes communal worship and charitable service. The contemplative phase aligns intention. The communal phase animates that intention into tangible impact. Secular activism follows a similar rhythm, with reflection groups and reading circles acting as secular monasteries, where conscience is sharpened before it strides into the corridors of power. Skipping the reflective stage risks unleashing zeal devoid of wisdom, whereas lingering indefinitely in introspection can calcify into self-referential piety. The art lies in maintaining a dynamic oscillation, inner silence feeding outer speech enriching inner silence. Emerging technologies now stretch the circumference of global dialogue further than any ancient oracle could envision. A teenager in Ramallah can live stream to viewers in Johannesburg, Sao Paulo, and Seoul, compressing geography into a shared real-time moral arena. Yet the ethics of such immediacy hinge on the integrity of the broadcaster's inner voice. If the internal narrative tilts towards sensationalism, the broadcast becomes spectacle. If it tilts toward truth-seeking, it becomes testimony, capable of moving parliaments and piercing propaganda firewalls. Hence the responsibility loops back. Cultivate the mind. because the microphone will only magnify whatever music or dissonance already plays within. Education systems too bear a role in shepherding this progression from interior rumination to civic articulation. Classrooms that prioritize debate, storytelling, and critical thinking act as rehearsal stages where students pilot their voices. Over time, those students graduate into citizens who regard dialogue not as a gladiatorial contest, but as a collaborative inquiry into collective well-being. Meanwhile, authoritarian regimes understand this principle, and therefore police self-talk through censorship and surveillance, hoping to arrest dialogue before it blossoms past private whisper. My friends, everything we have explored. Powerful self-talk. Courage that crosses borders. Nations holding up mirrors to our own conscience. The choice to speak with an original voice, and the journey from inner whisper to global chorus braids into a single luminous truth. Transformation begins in the unseen spaces of the heart, and does not stop until it reshapes the visible world. When we honor that continuum, we shift from being spectators of history to co-authors of its next more compassionate chapter.